Sarah Martinez never imagined that moving into Willowbrook Estates would turn into her worst nightmare. The young mother had saved every penny for 3 years to afford the down payment on the modest 2-bedroom townhouse. With its manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks, the gated community seemed like the perfect place to raise her 6-month-old daughter, Emma. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September. Sarah was enjoying her morning coffee on the small patio while Emma played in her bouncy seat, giggling at the colorful toys dangling above her. The morning sun filtered through the oak trees, creating dancing shadows on the ground. It was peaceful, exactly what Sarah had dreamed of when she signed the mortgage papers 6 months earlier. That tranquility shattered when Margaret Thornfield, the HOA president, marched across the lawn with purposeful strides. Margaret was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and glasses that seemed to magnify her disapproving stare. She carried a leather portfolio clutched against her chest like armor. "Ms. Martinez," Margaret announced without any greeting, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to discuss a serious violation of community standards." Sarah looked up from her coffee, confused. She had been meticulous about following every rule in the thick HOA handbook. Her garbage cans were stored properly. Her lawn was maintained, and she had even painted her front door the approved shade of burgundy from the color palette. "I'm sorry, what violation?" Sarah asked, shifting Emma to her hip as the baby began to fuss. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she opened her portfolio and pulled out a printed document. Noise complaints. Multiple residents have filed formal complaints about excessive noise coming from your unit during early morning and late evening hours. Sarah's mouth fell open. Noise complaints? I don't understand. I work from home doing graphic design. I barely make any noise at all. The crying, Margaret said coldly, her gaze fixed on baby Emma. Constant, disruptive crying that violates Section 12 of our community standards regarding noise pollution and disturbing the peace. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're talking about my baby crying?" "She's 6 months old. Babies cry." Margaret's expression remained unmoved. Willowbrook Estates is a community that values peace and quiet. When residents purchase homes here, they expect a certain standard of living. Excessive noise, regardless of the source, is not acceptable. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with anger and disbelief. "Are you seriously suggesting that my baby crying is a violation? This is a residential neighborhood, not a library." "I'm not suggesting anything," Margaret replied icily. "I'm informing you that you have received 3 formal complaints in the past month. According to our bylaws, that constitutes grounds for fines and potential legal action." Emma began crying as if sensing the tension in the air. Sarah bounced her gently, but Margaret's disapproving stare only intensified. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Margaret said, raising her voice over Emma's cries. "It's 10 in the morning and residents are trying to enjoy their peaceful morning routines." Sarah's protective instincts kicked in. "She's a baby, Mrs. Thornfield. She cries when she's hungry, tired, or needs her diaper changed. That's what babies do. It's not like I can reason with her or tell her to keep it down." Margaret pulled out another document from her portfolio. "This is your first official warning. You have 30 days to resolve this noise issue, or we will begin implementing fines of $200 per complaint." $200 per complaint? Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "That's insane. You can't fine someone for their baby crying." "We absolutely can and will," Margaret replied. "Every resident signed the same agreements when they purchased their homes. No one is above the community standards, not even new mothers." Sarah looked around the courtyard, noticing several neighbors peering through their windows at the confrontation. Some looked sympathetic, but others nodded approvingly at Margaret's words. She realized that this wasn't just about one cranky HOA president. There were actually people who supported this ridiculous complaint. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Soundproof my entire house? Give my baby sedatives? This is completely unreasonable." Margaret's smile was cold and calculated. "That's your problem to solve, Ms. Martinez. Perhaps you should have considered the impact of having a baby before moving into a community like Willowbrook Estates. There are plenty of apartment complexes in town that might be more suitable for your current lifestyle." The implication was clear. Margaret wanted Sarah and Emma gone. This wasn't about noise violations or community standards. This was about forcing out a young single mother who didn't fit Margaret's vision of the perfect neighborhood. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said firmly, standing up straighter. I have just as much right to live here as anyone else, and my daughter has the right to cry when she needs to. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. We'll see about that. You have 30 days, Ms. Martinez. I suggest you use that time wisely. As Margaret walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete, Sarah sank back into her patio chair with Emma still crying in her arms. She felt overwhelmed and alone, facing an impossible situation. How could she stop a baby from crying, and why should she have to? What Margaret Thornfield didn't know was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just any young mother trying to make ends meet. Hidden beneath her quiet exterior was a strength and determination that had carried her through law school at night, while working full-time to support herself. She had graduated summa cum laude just 2 years earlier, and had been working at a prestigious law firm before taking maternity leave to bond with Emma. Sarah had specialized in civil rights law, and had never lost a case involving discrimination or harassment. She knew exactly what Margaret was trying to do, and she knew exactly how to fight back. But first, she needed to understand just how deep this problem went and whether other families in the community had faced similar treatment. As she held Emma close and watched Margaret disappear into her house across the courtyard, Sarah began planning her next move. This HOA had picked the wrong baby to threaten. That evening, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of chamomile tea. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the baby monitor and the occasional sound of cars passing by outside. She opened a new document and began typing detailed notes about her confrontation with Margaret Thornfield. The more she thought about the morning's events, the angrier she became. The idea that a homeowners association could threaten to fine a resident for their baby crying was not only unreasonable, but potentially illegal. Sarah had studied housing discrimination law extensively, and she knew that targeting families with children could constitute a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her neighbor, Linda Chen, who lived 3 houses down. Saw the HOA president at your place this morning. Everything okay? Sarah smiled at the message. Linda was a nurse who worked night shifts at the local hospital and was always friendly when they crossed paths. She had even offered to babysit Emma if Sarah ever needed help. Unlike some of the other neighbors, Linda seemed genuinely kind and community-minded. Sarah called Linda instead of texting back. Hi Linda, thanks for checking on me. That was about Emma crying. Apparently it's a violation of community standards. Are you serious? Linda's voice was filled with disbelief. A baby crying is a violation? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. That's what I thought too. Have you had any problems with the HOA? Linda was quiet for a moment. Actually, yes. Last year they tried to fine me for having my car parked in my driveway instead of the garage. They said it was an eyesore, even though dozens of other residents do the same thing. I think they targeted me because I work nights and sometimes come home at odd hours. This revelation didn't surprise Sarah. She had suspected that Margaret's behavior toward her wasn't an isolated incident. Linda, would you be willing to meet tomorrow? I think there might be a pattern of discrimination here, and I'd like to understand the full scope of the problem. Absolutely. I've been wondering if anyone else has had issues with them. Come over around 10 tomorrow morning. I should be awake by then. After hanging up, Sarah spent the next 2 hours researching Willowbrook Estates' HOA history online. What she discovered was troubling. The community's online reviews were mixed, with several former residents mentioning harassment by management and selective enforcement of rules. One review from 8 months earlier stood out particularly. Moved out after. HOA made life unbearable for our family. They found violations for everything. Kids playing in yard too loudly, holiday decorations up 2 days past their arbitrary deadline, even complained about our teenage son's friends visiting. Felt like they were trying to force us out. Would not recommend to families with children. Sarah screenshot the review and added it to her growing file of evidence. She then searched for information about Margaret Thornfield and the other HOA board members. Margaret had been president for 4 years and had a background in property management. The vice president, Harold Brennan, was a retired military officer known for his strict interpretation of rules. As Sarah dug deeper, she found something interesting. In the past 3 years, 7 families with children had moved out of Willowbrook Estates. For a community of only 45 homes, that was a significant number. Meanwhile, families without children seemed to stay for much longer periods. The next morning, Sarah walked to Linda's house with Emma in her stroller. Linda welcomed them with fresh coffee and homemade muffins, immediately commenting on how beautiful and well-behaved Emma was. "She seems like such a happy baby," Linda said, offering Emma a colorful teething toy. "I can't believe anyone would complain about her crying. That's what I keep thinking. She really is a good baby. She sleeps through the night most of the time and only cries when she needs something." Linda settled into her chair with a serious expression. "Sarah, I need to tell you something else. After we talked last night, I remembered something. About 2 months ago, I was coming home from work early in the morning, maybe around 6 a.m. I heard a baby crying and saw Margaret Thornfield standing outside your house with her phone out, like she was recording." Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "She was recording Emma crying? It looked that way to me. She was holding her phone up toward your house and seemed to be timing something. When she saw my car, she quickly put the phone away and walked back to her house. This was a game changer. If Margaret had been deliberately recording Emma crying to build a case against them, it showed premeditation and possibly harassment." "Linda, would you be willing to write down exactly what you saw and sign it? This could be really important." "Of course. And Sarah, there's something else you should know. I think Margaret has been trying to change the community demographics for years. She's made comments before about wanting Willowbrook to be a quiet, adult-oriented community. I always thought it was just talk, but now I'm wondering if she's been actively working toward that goal." They spent the next hour documenting Linda's observations and experiences with the HOA. Linda also mentioned 2 other neighbors who had complained privately about selective enforcement and harassment tactics. After leaving Linda's house, Sarah decided to take a walk around the community with Emma. She wanted to observe the neighborhood dynamics and see if she could identify other families who might have faced similar treatment. Near the playground, she met Jennifer Walsh, a mother of 2 young boys who were climbing on the jungle gym. Jennifer looked tired and stressed, frequently calling for her children to keep their voices down. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Sarah said, parking Emma's stroller next to the bench where Jennifer sat. "Yes, though I'm always nervous about bringing the boys here," Jennifer replied. "We've gotten complaints about them being too loud during quiet hours, which apparently include most of the day." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Complaints from who?" "The HOA. Margaret Thornfield specifically. She says children playing loudly violates the community standards. We've been thinking about moving because it's becoming impossible to live here with kids." Sarah introduced herself and explained her own situation with Emma. Jennifer's relief at finding someone who understood was palpable. "I thought we were the only ones," Jennifer said. "They've made us feel like terrible neighbors just for having children who occasionally make noise while playing. It's gotten to the point where my boys are afraid to laugh too loudly outside." As they talked, Sarah learned that Jennifer's family had received over a dozen violation notices in the past year, all related to child noise or activities. They had been fined 3 times and were considering legal action, but felt overwhelmed by the process. By the end of the day, Sarah had a clear picture of what was happening at Willowbrook Estates. Margaret Thornfield and the HOA board were systematically targeting families with children, using vague noise ordinances and selective enforcement to make their lives so difficult that they would choose to leave. What they didn't realize was that they had just targeted someone with the knowledge, skills, and determination to fight back effectively. Sarah Martinez was about to turn their discriminatory tactics against them in a way they never saw coming. Sarah spent the weekend transforming her home office into a war room. She had always been methodical in her approach to legal cases, but this felt personal in a way that fueled her determination. Emma's crib was moved into Sarah's bedroom temporarily, so she could use the nursery as additional workspace for the growing mountain of evidence she was collecting. On Monday morning, she made her first strategic move. Instead of waiting for the HOA to escalate their threats, Sarah decided to go on the offensive. She requested copies of all HOA board meeting minutes for the past 3 years, all violation notices issued during that time, and the complete financial record showing how fines were assessed and collected. The request was submitted through the community management company, and Sarah knew that under state law they had 30 days to provide the documents. She also knew that the request itself would send a clear message that she wasn't going to be intimidated. Margaret Thornfield's response was swift and predictable. That afternoon, Sarah received a phone call from Harold Brennan, the HOA vice president. "Ms. Martinez, this is Harold Brennan from the Willowbrook Estates Board. I understand you've made some rather extensive document requests." "That's correct, Mr. Brennan. As a homeowner, I have the right to review HOA records." Harold's tone was condescending. "Of course you do. But I have to ask, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish here?" Margaret mentioned that you seemed upset about some routine noise complaints. Sarah chose her words carefully. "I'm simply trying to understand how the HOA operates and ensures fair treatment for all residents. I believe in transparency and due process." "Due process?" Harold chuckled. "Ms. Martinez, this isn't a court of law. It's a homeowners association trying to maintain property values and community standards. Perhaps you're overthinking this situation." "I don't think so, Mr. Brennan. In fact, I think the situation is exactly as serious as it appears." After hanging up, Sarah smiled to herself. Harold's dismissive attitude would work in her favor when this case eventually reached actual due process proceedings. That evening, Jennifer Walsh called with disturbing news. "Sarah, they're escalating things with us. We got a notice today that we're being fined $500 for allowing our children to play outside during designated quiet hours yesterday afternoon." "What time were they playing?" 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday. They were just playing catch in our backyard." Sarah felt her anger flare. "Jennifer, I need you to document everything. Take photos of the notice, write down exactly what your boys were doing, and save any witnesses who might have seen them playing normally." "Do you really think we can fight this?" "I know we can, but I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Don't pay any fines yet and don't sign anything they send you." The next morning brought Sarah's first major breakthrough. Linda Chen called with urgent news. "Sarah, you need to come over right away. I found something important." When Sarah arrived at Linda's house, she found her neighbor sitting at her kitchen table with a tablet and a determined expression. "I couldn't sleep last night thinking about all this, so I decided to do some research on Margaret Thornfield. Look what I found." Linda showed Sarah a series of social media posts and local newspaper articles. Margaret had been active in a community group called Preserving Neighborhood, character that advocated for zoning restrictions limiting the number of families with children in residential areas. "This is from 6 months before she became HOA president," Linda said, pointing to a Facebook post. She wrote, "Communities thrive when they cater to residents who value peace, quiet, and property maintenance over chaotic family activities." Sarah screenshot everything, her legal mind racing. This was evidence of discriminatory intent that could be crucial in court. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. Linda had also found Margaret's professional LinkedIn profile, which revealed that she had been hired as a consultant by 3 other HOAs in the region to help them optimize community demographics for property value enhancement. "She's literally making money by helping HOAs get rid of families with children," Linda said. "This isn't just personal bias, it's her business model." Sarah spent that afternoon reaching out to residents in the other communities where Margaret had consulted. The pattern was identical in each case: systematic harassment of families with children, selective enforcement of noise ordinances, and a gradual exodus of young families. One former resident, Maria Santos, was particularly helpful. "Our HOA hired Margaret after our property values dipped slightly. Within a year, she had made life so miserable for families that most of us moved away. The remaining residents were thrilled because the neighborhood was quieter. But they didn't realize that removing families actually hurt property values in the long run." Maria agreed to provide a written statement about her experiences and to serve as a witness if needed. By Wednesday, Sarah had enough evidence to file a formal complaint with the state's Fair Housing Authority. But she decided to try one more approach first. She scheduled a meeting with the full HOA board for Friday evening to present her findings and give them a chance to resolve the situation voluntarily. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the entrance of Willowbrook Estates. Sarah arrived early with Emma in her carrier and set up her laptop and documents at the conference table. Margaret, Harold, and the 3 other board members filed in looking irritated and dismissive. "Ms. Martinez," Margaret began without any pleasantries, "we understand you wanted to discuss your situation. But I hope you realize that making demands and requesting documents is not the way to resolve a simple noise complaint." Sarah opened her laptop and projected her presentation onto the wall screen. Actually, Mrs. Thornfield, this isn't about a simple noise complaint anymore. This is about a pattern of illegal discrimination against families with children. The room fell silent as Sarah began presenting her evidence. She showed the timeline of families moving out, the selective enforcement patterns, Margaret's social media posts, and her consulting work with other HOAs. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Now wait just a minute. You can't come in here making accusations without proof. I have proof. Mr. Brennan, I have documented evidence that this board has systematically targeted families with children using fraudulent noise complaints and selective rule enforcement. I also have evidence that Mrs. Thornfield has been hired specifically to remove families from residential communities. Margaret's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. That's absolutely ridiculous. We treat all residents equally. Sarah clicked to her next slide, which showed a chart comparing violation notices issued to families with children versus those without children. The disparity was stark and undeniable. The evidence suggests otherwise. In the past 3 years, families with children have received 87% of all violation notices, despite comprising only 31% of the community. The treasurer, an elderly woman named Dorothy Pierce, spoke for the first time. I had no idea the numbers were so skewed. Sarah sensed an opening. Mrs. Pierce, I don't believe all board members were aware of what was happening. That's why I'm presenting this information now before filing formal complaints with state and federal authorities. Margaret stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. You're making wild accusations that have no basis in reality. Actually, Mrs. Thornfield, this meeting isn't over until I say it is. You see, I haven't told you who I am yet. Sarah stood up and handed each board member a business card. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights and fair housing law. I've never lost a discrimination case, and I'm prepared to make this HOA and its board members personally liable for violations of federal fair housing statutes. The color drained from Harold's face as he read the business card. Margaret sat back down heavily, finally understanding that she had targeted the wrong family. You have 48 hours to rescind all fines and violation notices against families with children and to issue a written apology to affected residents. If you don't, I'll be filing complaints with every relevant authority and pursuing damages for harassment, discrimination, and violation of civil rights. As Sarah packed up her materials and lifted Emma's carrier, she turned back to the stunned board members. Oh, and just so we're clear, my daughter will continue to cry when she needs to because that's what healthy babies do. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me in federal court. The 48 hours that followed Sarah's ultimatum were the longest in Margaret Thornfield's career. She spent Friday night pacing her immaculate living room, trying to figure out how she had so badly misjudged the situation. Her phone rang constantly with calls from other board members, community management, and even her lawyer. Harold Brennan was the first to crack. He called Margaret at 7 Saturday morning, his voice shaky with panic. Margaret, we need to talk. I just spent the night reading about fair housing violations online. Do you realize we could be facing personal liability here? Not just the HOA, us individually? Don't be dramatic, Harold. She's just one resident making threats. One resident who happens to be a civil rights attorney with a perfect track record. Harold's voice rose to nearly a shout. I looked her up, Margaret. Sarah Martinez has won every single discrimination case she's ever filed. She's represented clients against major corporations, government agencies, and yes, homeowners associations. Margaret felt her stomach drop. You're sure it's the same person? Dead sure. She made headlines 3 years ago, when she won a $2 million settlement against a HOA in California for disability discrimination. The case is taught in law schools now. That afternoon, Dorothy Pierce, the treasurer, requested an emergency board meeting. When the 5 members gathered in Dorothy's living room, the atmosphere was tense and frightened. I've been reviewing our violation records since Friday night, Dorothy announced, spreading papers across her coffee table. What Sarah Martinez showed us was absolutely accurate. We've issued 37 violation notices to families with children in the past year alone, compared to only 6 notices to households without children. Margaret tried to maintain control. Children naturally make more noise and cause more violations. It's not discrimination, it's reality. Margaret, said board member Tom Chen, Linda's neighbor and a retired judge, I kept quiet during that meeting because I was shocked by what I was hearing. But now that I've had time to process it, I need to tell you that what we've been doing is not just morally wrong, it's illegal under federal law. Tom's legal background carried significant weight with the other board members. When a former judge said they were breaking the law, people listened. The Fair Housing Act explicitly protects families with children, Tom continued. Selective enforcement of rules against families, particularly using subjective standards like excessive noise from children, is textbook discrimination. We're not just facing fines, we could be looking at criminal charges. Margaret felt the room turning against her. We were just trying to maintain property values and community standards. By driving out families? Dorothy asked, her voice filled with disgust. Margaret, I moved here because I thought it would be a nice place for my grandchildren to visit. I never agreed to participate in some scheme to create an adults-only community. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Margaret increasingly isolated as the other board members realized the scope of their legal exposure. By the end, a clear majority had formed around Tom's proposal to immediately comply with Sarah's demands and hope to avoid prosecution. Sunday evening, Margaret called Sarah's number with trembling fingers. Ms. Martinez, this is Margaret Thornfield. I'm calling to discuss the situation we spoke about on Friday. Sarah's voice was calm and professional. Mrs. Thornfield, do you have a response to my proposal? The board has voted to rescind all violation notices and fines issued to families with children over the past 3 years. We'll also be issuing written apologies to affected residents. That's a good start. What about preventing future discrimination? Margaret swallowed hard. We're prepared to revise our community standards to ensure fair enforcement across all residents regardless of family status. And your resignation from the board? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. My resignation wasn't part of your original demands. Consider it an additional requirement. Your documented history of anti-family bias makes it impossible for you to serve effectively on a board governing a diverse residential community. Margaret wanted to argue, but she knew she had no leverage. I'll need to discuss this with the other board members. You have until tomorrow at noon, Mrs. Thornfield. After that, my next call will be to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Monday morning brought a flurry of activity throughout Willowbrook Estates. Word had spread quickly about Sarah's confrontation with the HOA board, and residents were taking sides. Some were appalled by the discriminatory practices they hadn't realized were happening, while others were angry that their peaceful community was being disrupted. Linda Chen knocked on Sarah's door at 10 a.m. with fresh coffee and pastries. I wanted to check on you before the deadline. How are you holding up? Sarah looked tired but determined. Emma was having a cranky morning and had been crying more than usual, which felt almost ironic given the circumstances. I'm fine, but I'm prepared for this to get ugly before it gets better. Change is never easy, especially when people have to confront their own biases. At 11:30, Margaret Thornfield called back. Ms. Martinez, the board has accepted all of your terms. I'll be submitting my resignation this afternoon and will begin implementing the policy changes immediately. What about the apologies to affected families? Those will be sent out today as well. We're also prepared to refund all fines that were improperly assessed. Sarah felt a wave of satisfaction, but she kept her voice neutral. That's acceptable, Mrs. Thornfield. I'll be monitoring the situation closely to ensure compliance. There is one thing I need to ask, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Will you be pursuing legal action against the board or the HOA? Sarah considered the question carefully. She had the evidence to pursue significant damages and could probably force policy changes throughout the entire management company. But her primary goal had been to protect her daughter and other families in the community, as long as the changes are implemented in good faith and no retaliation occurs against any residents who supported my position. I'm prepared to consider this matter resolved. However, I'll be documenting everything, and any backsliding will result in immediate legal action. That afternoon, official letters went out to every resident of Willowbrook Estates. The board announced Margaret's resignation, the policy changes regarding family-friendly enforcement, and a commitment to creating a more inclusive community environment. Jennifer Walsh called Sarah that evening, crying with relief. I can't believe it worked. My boys can actually play outside without me worrying about complaints. Thank you so much for fighting for all of us. But not everyone was celebrating. Sarah received several anonymous notes criticizing her for ruining the peaceful nature of the community and forcing unwanted changes on longtime residents. Few neighbors stopped speaking to her entirely, and she noticed some cold stares during her walks with Emma. Tom Chen was elected as the new HOA president, and one of his first acts was to establish a family activities committee to organize child-friendly events and ensure that community policies supported residents of all ages. 2 weeks after Margaret's resignation, Sarah was surprised to receive a visit from her former adversary. Margaret stood on Sarah's doorstep looking defeated and aged, carrying a small gift bag. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to apologize personally for my behavior toward you and your daughter. I brought a small gift for Emma." Sarah invited her in, curious about what Margaret wanted to say. They sat in the living room while Emma played contentedly on her activity mat. "I want you to know that I never saw myself as discriminatory," Margaret began. "I genuinely thought I was protecting property values and maintaining community standards. But watching you present your evidence, seeing the numbers laid out so clearly, I realized that my actions had caused real harm to families." Sarah studied Margaret's face, looking for signs of sincerity. "What changed your mind?" "My daughter called me after she heard about the resignation. She told me she had been considering moving to Willowbrook with her 2 young children, but decided against it because she felt unwelcome during her visits. I never realized that my policies were pushing away my own family." Margaret's voice broke slightly as she continued. "I lost sight of what communities are supposed to be about, bringing people together, not dividing them. I'm sorry for what I put you through, and I'm sorry for all the families I drove away." Sarah felt an unexpected wave of empathy for the older woman. "Margaret, it takes courage to admit when we've been wrong. The important thing is that you're willing to learn and change." As Margaret prepared to leave, she looked down at Emma, who was babbling happily at her toys. "She really is a beautiful baby. I hope she grows up in a community that celebrates children instead of treating them like problems to solve." After Margaret left, Sarah reflected on the past month's events. The victory felt complete, but it had taught her important lessons about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. 3 months after Margaret's resignation, Willowbrook Estates had transformed into a completely different community. The changes weren't just policy-related, they were cultural and social in ways that surprised even Sarah. What had started as a legal battle over Emma's crying had evolved into a broader conversation about what kind of community the residents wanted to live in. Tom Chen proved to be an exceptional HOA president. His first major initiative was organizing a community-wide meeting to discuss the future direction of Willowbrook Estates. Unlike the sterile board meetings of Margaret's era, this gathering felt more like a neighborhood block party. Sarah attended with Emma, who was now 9 months old and had started crawling everywhere. The community clubhouse was packed with residents she had never seen before. Families who had been keeping to themselves during Margaret's reign were finally coming out of hiding. "Before we talk about new policies," Tom announced to the crowd, "I think we need to acknowledge what's been happening in our community and commit to doing better." Dorothy Pierce, who had remained on the board, stood up to address the room. "Many of us were unaware of how our HOA policies were affecting families with children. We allowed fear and misunderstanding to guide our decisions instead of compassion and inclusion." One resident, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, raised his hand. "I want to apologize publicly to the families I complained about. I thought children playing outside was disruptive, but now I realize those sounds were actually signs of a healthy, vibrant community." Frank's words opened the floodgates. Other residents began sharing their own experiences and admitting to complaints they now regretted. The atmosphere was surprisingly emotional and healing. Jennifer Walsh spoke about how the discrimination had affected her children psychologically. "My oldest son, Tyler, started having anxiety about playing outside. He would ask me if it was okay to laugh or if his voice was too loud. No child should have to worry about those things in their own neighborhood." After the meeting, something remarkable happened. Residents who had never spoken to each other began forming connections. Linda Chen organized a monthly potluck dinner for families. Frank Morrison, the elderly man who had apologized, started an afternoon reading program for children at the clubhouse. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. Margaret Thornfield, despite no longer living in the community, had been quietly working on something that would benefit everyone. Sarah discovered this when she received a call from a local reporter named Jessica Park, who covered community affairs for the regional newspaper. "Ms. Martinez, I'm working on a story about HOA discrimination and reform. Margaret Thornfield reached out to me and suggested I speak with you about what happened at Willowbrook Estates." Sarah was surprised. "Margaret called you?" "She did. She said she wanted to use her experience as a cautionary tale to help other communities avoid the mistakes she made. She's been speaking at HOA conferences across the state, talking about the legal and community costs of discriminatory policies." The article that Jessica eventually published had a significant impact beyond Willowbrook Estates. Titled "When Baby Cries Became Battle Cries," One Mother's Fight Against HOA Discrimination, it detailed Sarah's legal victory and the community transformation that followed. The story caught the attention of fair housing advocates, legal professionals, and other HOAs looking to reform their practices. Sarah began receiving calls from attorneys handling similar cases and from residents in other communities facing comparable discrimination. One call particularly moved her. It came from Maria Rodriguez, a young mother in Arizona whose HOA was threatening to fine her for her toddler's noise. "I read about your case online," Maria said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They're telling me that my 2-year-old running around our apartment is a violation of quiet enjoyment rules. I don't know what to do." Sarah spent an hour on the phone with Maria, walking her through the legal protections available and connecting her with a local fair housing attorney. It was the first of many such calls she would receive. The success at Willowbrook Estates also attracted attention from the state's Department of Housing and Urban Development. They launched an investigation into discriminatory practices by HOAs throughout the region, using Sarah's documentation as a model for identifying patterns of illegal behavior. Meanwhile, life in Willowbrook had become genuinely pleasant. The playground that had once been nearly empty was now bustling with children and families. The community garden, which had been restricted to quiet activities only, became a gathering place where neighbors of all ages worked side by side. Emma was thriving in this new environment. At 9 months old, she was a confident social baby who seemed to enjoy all the attention from neighbors who had once complained about her crying. During community events, she would crawl from person to person, charming even the most reserved residents. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Sarah was at the playground with Emma when Margaret Thornfield appeared at the gate. Sarah hadn't seen her since the apologetic visit 3 months earlier, and she looked different, more relaxed and genuinely happier. "I hope it's okay that I came by," Margaret said hesitantly. "I was in the neighborhood and wanted to see how the community was doing." "Of course it's okay," Sarah replied, lifting Emma from the swing. "How are you doing?" Margaret smiled as she watched Emma babble and reach for a butterfly. "I'm doing well, actually. Better than I have in years. I've been working with fair housing organizations, helping them identify problematic HOA policies before they lead to discrimination cases." "That's wonderful, Margaret. It takes real courage to use your experience to help others. I wanted to thank you again, Sarah. Fighting back against my policies didn't just protect your family. It saved me from becoming someone I never wanted to be. I was so focused on control and order that I forgot communities are supposed to be about people, not rules." They sat together on a bench, watching the children play. The sounds that had once generated complaint letters, laughter, shouting, the squeak of swings now seemed like the natural soundtrack of a healthy neighborhood. "You know," Margaret continued, "I've been thinking about getting a place closer to my daughter and grandchildren, somewhere that welcomes families instead of tolerating them." Sarah noticed that Emma had crawled over to Margaret and was pulling herself up using Margaret's leg for support. Instead of seeming annoyed or concerned about her clothes, Margaret gently helped Emma stand and made silly faces that sent the baby into giggles. "She really is a special little girl," Margaret said softly. "I'm sorry I never took the time to see that before." As Margaret prepared to leave, she turned back to Sarah with a serious expression. "I know this might sound strange, but I'm grateful for what happened. You didn't just win a legal battle. You helped our entire community remember what it means to be neighbors." That evening, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken since moving to Willowbrook Estates. What had started as a search for a safe, quiet place to raise Emma had evolved into something much more meaningful. She had found her voice as an advocate, built genuine friendships with neighbors, and helped create the kind of community she had always dreamed of for her daughter. As she tucked Emma into her crib that night, Sarah whispered, "You know, little one, your crying ended up changing everything for the better. Sometimes the loudest voices, even baby voices, are exactly what the world needs to hear." Emma responded with a sleepy gurgle that sounded almost like agreement, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them in a community that had learned to celebrate differences instead of silencing them. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, Willowbrook Estate celebrated its first annual Community Harmony Day. The idea had come from Linda Chen, who suggested that they needed a way to commemorate their transformation and commit to maintaining their inclusive values. Sarah stood at the edge of the community center lawn, watching Emma take her first wobbly steps across the grass. At 15 months old, Emma was a confident toddler who had no memory of the conflict that had shaped her community. She stumbled toward a group of children playing with bubbles, her delighted squeals adding to the cheerful noise that now filled Willowbrook regularly. The changes over the past year had been remarkable. Property values had actually increased as word spread about the family-friendly atmosphere, attracting young families who had previously avoided HOA communities. The playground had been expanded with new equipment, and a small splash pad had been installed for the summer months. Tom Chen approached Sarah with a clipboard and a wide smile. "Sarah, we've got the final numbers for this year's family satisfaction survey. 96% of residents say they feel more connected to their neighbors than they did 2 years ago." "That's incredible, Tom. What about the 4% who didn't?" Tom chuckled. "Those were mostly people who said they were too new to the community to have a baseline for comparison. Everyone else, including some residents who initially opposed the changes, reported feeling more satisfied with community life." The success of Willowbrook's transformation had attracted attention from urban planning researchers and housing policy experts. Dr. Amanda Foster from the State University had been conducting a case study on the community, examining how rapid cultural change could occur in residential settings. "What we're seeing here challenges a lot of assumptions about HOA governance," Dr. Foster had told Sarah during an interview the previous month. "The traditional model focuses on rule enforcement and property preservation, but Willowbrook proves that communities thrive when they prioritize relationship building and inclusion." The research had practical implications beyond academic interest. 3 other HOAs in the region had contacted Tom Chen for advice on reforming their own policies and culture. Margaret Thornfield, now working as a consultant for inclusive community development, had been hired by 2 of them to help implement changes. Margaret had become an unexpected ally in the broader movement for HOA reform. Her transformation from discriminatory enforcer to inclusive advocate had made her a powerful voice for change. She spoke at conferences with a unique perspective, someone who had participated in harmful practices and could explain both the mindset that enabled them and the process of reform. "Used to believe that good communities required uniformity," Margaret had said during a recent presentation that Sarah attended. "I thought that meant keeping out anything that might disrupt an artificial sense of peace. What I learned is that real community peace comes from embracing diversity and working through conflicts together." The legal precedent set by Sarah's case had also created broader impacts. The state legislature had passed new regulations requiring HOAs to undergo fair housing training and to document the reasoning behind any violation notices issued to families with children. Several other attorneys had used Sarah's research methodology to identify and challenge discriminatory patterns in their own cases. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Sarah had discovered a passion for community advocacy that extended far beyond her legal career. She had started a nonprofit organization called Family Friendly Communities that helped residents in other neighborhoods identify and challenge discriminatory housing practices. The organization's website featured Willowbrook Estates as a success story, with before and after photos of community events and testimonials from residents. Jennifer Walsh had become one of the most effective advocates, sharing her story at workshops and helping other parents document harassment they were experiencing. On this sunny afternoon, celebrating Community Harmony Day, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them all together. Emma, now chasing a butterfly across the lawn, had no idea that her infant cries had sparked a revolution in community relations. Frank Morrison, the elderly resident who had once complained about children's noise, was now leading a group of kids in a game of gentle tag. His transformation had been particularly touching. He had shared with Sarah that interacting with the children had helped him feel less lonely after his wife's death. "You know," Frank had told her a few months earlier, "I thought quiet was what I wanted, but I confused quiet with peaceful. Now I realize that children's laughter is one of the most peaceful sounds in the world." Dorothy Pierce approached Sarah carrying an official-looking envelope. "Sarah, this came for you today. It looks important." The envelope was from the State Bar Association, and Sarah's heart rate quickened as she opened it. Inside was a letter notifying her that she had been selected to receive the Outstanding Community Service Award for her work in fair housing advocacy. "What's that about?" Linda Chen asked, appearing at Sarah's shoulder. "The State Bar wants to give me an award for the HOA work," Sarah said, still processing the honor. "That's wonderful. You deserve recognition for everything you've accomplished." The award ceremony would be held in 3 months, and Sarah was invited to give a keynote speech about using legal skills for community advocacy. She immediately thought about Emma, who would be walking confidently by then and might even be saying a few words. As the afternoon wound down, residents began gathering for the closing ceremony of Community Harmony Day. Tom Chen had prepared a brief speech about the community's journey and future goals. "A year ago, some of us thought that a good community meant avoiding conflict and maintaining silence," Tom said to the assembled crowd. "What we've learned is that a great community means working through conflicts with respect and ensuring that everyone's voice can be heard, even the youngest voices." As if on cue, Emma let out a happy shriek from her spot on the playground, causing the entire crowd to burst into laughter and applause. Margaret Thornfield, who had been invited as a special guest, stepped forward to address the community she had once tried to control through fear and exclusion. "I want to thank this community for teaching me that admitting mistakes isn't the end of leadership, it's the beginning of wisdom." The courage that Sarah Martinez showed in standing up to unjust policies didn't just protect her family. It created a ripple effect that has improved lives across our entire state. Sarah felt Emma tugging on her leg and picked up her daughter, who immediately began babbling enthusiastically to the crowd. The same sounds that had once generated violation notices were now met with smiles and encouraging words. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom announced with a grin, "I think Emma Martinez Rodriguez wants to give the closing remarks." Emma responded with a string of happy babbles and clapped her hands, which the crowd interpreted as the perfect ending to their celebration. As families began packing up their picnic supplies and folding chairs, Sarah noticed several residents exchanging phone numbers and making plans for future gatherings. The community that had once been divided by fear and suspicion had become genuinely connected through shared experiences and mutual support. Walking home with Emma in her stroller, Sarah passed the house where Margaret Thornfield used to live. The new owners, a young couple with twins, had added colorful wind chimes and a small sandbox to the front yard. Children's toys were scattered on the porch, and the sound of family life drifted through the open windows. It was exactly the kind of scene that would have generated complaint letters under the old regime, but now it represented everything the community had grown to value: life, energy, and the beautiful chaos that comes with raising the next generation. That evening, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah sat on her patio with a cup of tea and reflected on the unexpected adventure that had started with a simple HOA violation notice. She had moved to Willowbrook seeking a quiet place to raise her daughter, but instead had found something much more valuable: a community that celebrated children and supported families through both challenges and joys. Emma's room was peacefully quiet for once, but Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new sounds, new discoveries, and new adventures. And now, thanks to their year-long journey, those sounds would be welcomed as the natural soundtrack of a community that had learned to embrace life in all its beautiful, noisy, imperfect glory.